So first cab off the rank is Yvonne Cristiano. Yvonne, put your hand up. This is Yvonne. So Yvonne, or Evie as we know her, has been working with our unit pretty much in research since, how long now? Since 2007, but before that she worked in the heart and lung transplant unit as a VAG coordinator and transplant coordinator as well, and has been around a long time. So, Yvonne, one of the big projects that Evie's been working on for many years has been about the cytomegalovirus, CMV. So Evie, why don't you tell us about the CMV study, how much work it's been working on these studies over the years, what benefits you've seen for the patients, and have you got any funny stories to tell?
In the community that we all get is a cold and flu. And for transplant patients, it actually has quite a big impact. It can actually lead to long-term injury in the lungs and actually eventually rejection. So it's something that as a transplant recipient, we want to actually avoid them developing. The team put together a project that was looking at the way we currently use our antiviral medications and seeing if we can modify this according to the blood test, which is what Glenn mentioned in his, the Clyden assay. This assay was supposed to let us know whether the patient had some CMV immunity or not in themselves. So individualised how we could actually look at CMV in the patients. And then we would actually govern how long we would leave them on the antiviral medication for based on this blood test. Now we had about 120 fabulous participants that took part. I was going to say it went for 5 years, but I looked back at the ethics application of 2012, so it's actually been 6 years actually in the running, but we eventually finished the data collection last year. Now it was, as Roman said, a very long study, but the implications for the patient is huge. Obviously, as you know, that, as I mentioned, that it can actually result in graft failure in the long term. This study was really important on how we could actually improve care. It's been very successful, and we've actually now changed our current CMV protocol based on this study to actually change how long patients are on valganciclovir for. For me, it's exciting. Coming from a nursing background, I like to still have a link to, I don't know, I guess patients in some way. So there was a lot of patient contact for me in this study, which was quite enjoyable from my side. But also to be able to look at the fact that we've now changed our care. We're actually hopefully seeing better outcomes because of this. And it's really, and the rewarding fact is just watching the way participants involved. I think sometimes, looking at funny stories, is that we've actually got to tell patients to stop consenting before they've actually heard the information. There's such a willing group of patients to say, yes, if this is going to help someone else, I don't care if it doesn't help me, if it helps someone else, I'm going to be part of it. And I have to say, no. Read this information, let me tell you about it, answer it, I'm going to give you some questions. Because they will just grab that form and sign and say, yep, no worries, that's got full informed consent, I can't take it. So it's amazing to be involved in patients who participate so committed to research and so committed to what the outcomes can be. And they know right up front that there's no guarantee it's going to help them personally, they're just doing it for the longevity of transplantation, how it can improve the future as well as possibly then the future. Do I ask the question, Brian? Hey? What was the question?
Oh, no, that's good. Well done. So you're also now working on a couple of other studies. One of them is the stem cell study, and also the interlung study, which is the new way of diagnosing rejection with the microarray biopsies. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about the stem cell study and what you're doing with that, and also the other one, interlung study as well.
Okay, both of these studies are linking, I guess, into one's looking at, the interlung study is the one looking at the biopsies and getting a more detailed biopsy report to be able to look at rejection and grade rejection and lead treatment. With this study, we're looking at a population of patients who having bronchoscopies done for sort of anticipated abnormal findings because they're not well or we're thinking something's abnormal. And we're taking these samples and sending them off to Canada to have them analysed, and the results come back to us. Greg loves to say the tissue goes to Canada and is back to us with a report in 4 days, and it goes downstairs and is back to us within 5 days. So that's Greg's always linked to how the turnaround time in coming with these results. Patients, once again, are very willing to take part. This study, there really is no benefit because with this little the microarray analysis process is still being tested, so we can't treat off the results that we're getting. Or despite the fact they're giving us good information in the guide, we can't look at them and just start blanketly treating off them. So patients really aren't getting any direct benefit, but what they're seeing from us is that there is potential in the future. And to be, for me, getting my head around this microarray, it's been really interesting to grasp concepts that I haven't even thought about or had any idea about. So it's a really interesting project, that one, from that perspective. The stem cells, as Glenn said, everyone loves stem cells. And patients are very excited about the idea if they're getting chronic rejection that possibly stem cells might be able to halt the progress of the rejection or might be able to, in fact, improve lung function in the long term. This one's a little bit more challenging. It is a randomised trial, so patients are either getting stem cells or getting placebo. So it's a little bit anxious for patients, and they are regularly saying, oh, I hope I'm getting their stem cells. But we're blinded as much as they are, so we don't know what's going on whatsoever. And it's a tough one because the placebo is a very nerve-wracking angle for them. The other thing is the eligibility criteria. It's difficult when you can't actually get patients in because it's such a strict eligibility criteria. You think, oh, it would have been really nice, but you've fallen outside of that criteria as well. I had something I was going to say like this about that, but it's gone from my mind. So it's been, look, they're great, interesting, they're very things that are coming up for future management of patients, and hopefully in the long term will improve the survival of patients. I think when I went to the very first one, I sat down and I kind of thought, oh, here we go, we'll go listen to all these talks that are going on. And as I sat and listened and I moved from place to place, I'm thinking, we do that. We did that 10 years ago. And it took me that realisation to just see how world leading we are in a lot of things, or you don't realise it when you're part of it. You're just part of a team who are working hard, committed to good patient outcomes, committed to patient care. And to watch that was really quite, I guess, I don't know, a bit overwhelming really to see that how far in advance we are from a lot of current practices, how much we question more, how much the physicians are valued as leaders worldwide, and the respect they have from the whole international community was really wonderful to see. And even just being someone in the background who just does a bit of the legwork, it's exciting. It's really exciting.
Data collection? You're just a database manager, is that right? Someone might have said that.
It's really exciting to see projects, particularly like the CMV study that we have worked on for 5 years, presented and being a great study at these sort of meetings, so it's really exciting.
Linda's been with part of our respiratory department actually for a long time. She used to work in the cardiothoracic area as well, and then about 17 years ago started off in research in respiratory medicine and has helped over the years with lung transplant studies, and now is part of the lung transplant team officially. So I'm going to ask Linda to talk a little bit about her involvement in the Biomarkers Study, which is one of the studies we've been running for a long time. And one of the things is, can you tell us a little bit about all the work that goes on behind the scenes trying to track these patients that you're collecting samples on?
Yes, it relates to something that Glenn was talking about, but looking at biomarkers and how they interact and how they cause rejection and stuff like that. But all of the samples that are looked at in Lucy's lab and other people's labs have to come from the patients. And they come from the times when the patients get their routine bronchoscopies. So we have to track the patients to find out when they're going to have those routine bronchoscopies. And Evie has got a fantastic spreadsheet and system of working out when this is going to happen. But the bronchoscopy list is a bit of a movable feast, really, and it changes from day to day. So we have to make sure that every day we check, see when these patients are going to be seen in the bronchoscopy suite, so that we make sure we can collect the samples at that time. And I can't stress enough really that we invest a lot of time in maintaining a relationship with the bronchoscopy suite staff, because without their goodwill these samples would not be taken. So we do that. And then, of course, we have to make sure that the samples get to where they're meant to go. So some will go to our lab at the Alfred, some will go to someone else who will collect them, or some will be ones that we maybe have to send overseas. So there's a lot to do with the samples once they've been collected and we go and find them. So it's really a twofold process, but invariably it works, sometimes it doesn't, and then we have to sort of look at what we can do to put that right and, start again.
Tell us a little bit about the work you've done already and what we're up to and what you can see sort of for the future for the IVIG study from your...
Yeah, I'm looking over there. Is this a study I'm not allowed to talk about, isn't it? This, I just want to quote Gordon, really, that you can't microwave research. There's a lot that we have to do up front before we can even start to recruit patients into a study. And the main one really is getting a protocol that's going to work. So there's a lot of work to be done with other departments to make sure that they can provide the support that we need. And then there's a lot of work to do with the ethics submissions. Ethics approval can take anything from about 2 months. I don't think I've ever had ethics approval in less than 2 months, but can take 9 months, sometimes up to a year to get through if you have to go to other committees and do lots of background work for the committee. So it can be a very, very long process. So that's a lot of our upfront work, is filling in forms, submitting, getting signatures, and then going back and answering questions that they have. So once we have ethics approval, then we have to actually set up the logistics of doing the trial. And I won't say too much, but there are problems with getting drugs and other products released. So there have to be where we have to pay people to store the drug and then dispense the drugs. And I think, a lot of that is money that you don't realise it is needed, but nobody likes to do something for nothing.
And you're, I was going to say, one of our most experienced clinical research nurse coordinators. I wasn't going to say the oldest, just more experienced, and have worked with our respiratory department and our teams in the department for many years. Because you're sort of relatively new back into the lung transplant team fold, are there any sort of idiosyncrasies you see working with the lung transplant team versus other members of the department, even though they're some of the same? Is it better, dare I say? More challenging?
I think they compare pretty well. I think...
Well,
they don't pay any better than any other department. I've been around for a while. And I've actually had the privilege to work on some amazing trials, some first-in-human studies and interventional device trials. And I've had a really enjoyable career doing that. But since I've come back into the lung transplant unit proper, I've started to work on investigator-initiated trials and collaborative trials that I've never done before. And I see the slight, the difference is probably the investment in these trials that the clinicians have and the belief that they can actually achieve something good for the patient. And they're incredibly motivated and invested to get outcomes from their trials. And really, their motivation is purely to make life better and to get better outcomes for their patients.
Okay, we're going to move on now to Lucy Sullivan. So Lucy has been a research scientist for 15 years, PhD, originally from Adelaide, we won't hold that against you, but now lives here, and has been essentially started working with Glenn when he was doing his PhD in 2003 and had an interest in transplant immunology since. And she's recently become part of our team as well, which is great. So, Lucy, what are the most interesting aspects of lab work that are being done currently from your perspective that you can see translating from, the bench to the bedside, as we call it? You look at cells and all sorts of things, but tell us a little bit about what you see from your end.
Yeah, so as Glenn briefly mentioned, I work on primarily sort of on a cell type called an NK cell. What he didn't mention was that stands for natural killer cell, which is a cool name anyway to start off with, right? But the really interesting thing about these cells is what I'm trying to unpick, are they good guys or are they bad guys? And what we're starting to learn is that it's not really a one-size-fits-all for every recipient, and that these cells actually change in individual recipients, and it's possible that we can use them for biomarkers of both rejection and also infection. So I think that that's pretty cool.
Getting grants is probably based a lot around NHMRC type grants, but have you had much involvement in the not-for-profit sort of support like philanthropic organisations like Lungitude, or has it mainly become from government type grants? And what's the difference that you're sort of maybe noticing?
Yeah, so as a research scientist until quite recently, I was entirely restricted to NH and MRC funding. And unlike Gordon, NH and MRC love the word no. And Glenn mentioned the funding was 15%. That's actually incorrect. Last year it was down to 11%. So that means that 90% of our scientists are not getting funding. And what that also means is that you need to have a research project that's incredibly mature for it to be funded. It has to work, essentially. So how do we get the funding for the preliminary experiments? And that's where Lungitude are incredibly important. And it also, working with the NH and MRC system, it doesn't really give you a lot of scientific freedom for those just, I have an idea and how do I show that preliminary data? And that's where philanthropic funding is really crucial.
So, in the short time that you've sort of been working with our team, which is about a year or so, can you think of 3 of the best things that you've found so far working with us, and maybe 3 of the quirkiest things?
Wow, 3 of the best things. Okay. Well, it's funny because I am actually writing an NH and MRC application at the moment, which, going back to NH and MRC, is complete hell. But one of the enjoyable things I found out about this, I'm writing one with Greg this year, and I knew he was good, but I didn't know he was that good. I'm looking at his CV, just going, whoa. So I guess one of the best things is I actually feel quite humbled to be able to work with a team that is absolutely the world leaders of lung transplant research. And so that's one. And the other thing is they actually are really passionate about both their patients and their research, and to find that in clinician researchers is pretty rare. And number 3, they're fun and they're nice. So, yeah. So what was the second part? So?
Any quirky things that you found out?
I don't want to get myself in trouble. So Bron, I've never seen her wear the same pair of earrings twice. Yeah. Apparently Greg makes a really mean paella. Haven't tried it yet, but maybe one day. Yeah. And Glenn, well, I've known Glenn for a long time, so I know quite a lot about Glenn. But he's a really, really good snowboarder, and he actually abandoned me on the slopes one day. So yeah, that wasn't very nice, but good thing is he's a really, really excellent athlete. So yeah. When it comes to snowboarding anyway.
Okay, and last but not least, I'm going to pass over to Dr. Chilai, who's actually a palliative care physician she's been actually working with our lung transplant program even since he was an intern at the Alfred in 2009, I think, is that right?
Yeah,
and a resident, sorry. And then worked further with our Department over the years, and actually in 2015 undertook a project with the palliative care service and our service looking at living with lung transplant study. So one of the reasons I invited Chi along today was I thought it was really important for him to feed back to you some interesting information that he got from this study. So Chi, one of the things I want to ask you, and someone's already asked me this, you work in palliative care and you see patients in our clinics both pre and post-transplant, and that might seem a little unusual for a palliative care physician to work in lung transplant. So do you just want to give us a little bit of an overview of how you got involved and what you do?
So, I mean, I get that question every time I see a transplant patient, obviously, but so I think most people in the community and pretty much everyone I see think that palliative care means that they're dying. It's only for people who are dying, and so the first thing I always do is to reassure them that that's not the reason I'm seeing them, and really the reason the palliative care is involved is because palliative care is actually about helping people to live as well as they can when they have a life-threatening problem. And so, particularly if you're pre-transplant, by definition, the reason you're needing a transplant is because you have a life-threatening lung disease. And based on my experience as a junior doctor, particularly pre-transplant, the patients and families often have a pretty tough time, and I think that's despite all the good work that the team does. And so I think, as a junior doctor, and since then over the years, we've realised that we want to and we should try and do a little bit more to try and help them, and that's what palliative care is about. The other thing that people often think is that if you're seeing a palliative care doctor or team, it means that you're not going to get a transplant, and that's also not true. I think palliative care is not something that's an alternative. It's something that you add on to whatever care you're getting. And so, particularly in the pre-transplant setting, often these people are on the waiting list. They're waiting to get on. They're desperate to get on. And so one of the other things I say is that my job is to help you to get to the transplant. That's what we're doing here. But it's going to, you're having a pretty tough time. That's why you're seeing me. And so my job is to try and help you get there in as a good shape as possible as we can. So it's in a way, it's very similar to what Ben and Lou are doing in physio and what the dietitians are trying to do, but just with a slightly different focus, yeah.
What sort of information did you get from that study that then could help inform what we do and how we look after our patients better?
So to sort of echo what Evie was saying before, I think when Greg and I sort of talked about this, what we really wanted to find out is not just our impression of what it's like for someone and their family to have a transplant, but from the patient and their carers themselves to in their own words, I guess, to tell us what it's like and what kind of support they needed. And similar to what sort of Evie said, I think we were really surprised at how many people actually wanted to participate. And so we got hundreds and hundreds of responses, and many people here might have remember filling one of my surveys for the Living in Lung Transplant study. It's one of the largest studies, if not the largest study in the world, that's actually looked at this topic, and so that's really incredible. And what we found was, I guess the most important thing we found, which perhaps isn't surprising, is that people don't do very well. They're not feeling very well pre-transplant, but after transplant it makes them feel a lot better. So it's not just about living longer, but it's also that it makes them feel better, and that's really a very important point. So we kind of suspected that was happening, but it was good to know for sure that that's what's happening. The surprising things, I guess, are that patients and their families, we found, have different experiences and different needs. So often our focus is primarily on the patient, and that's fair. But I think what we realised is that we also need to really pay attention to their family and their care and find out how we can better support them, because they often need very different things. So that's one thing. The second thing is that people need different things at different stages of transplantation. So I think if we just give them the same thing at every stage, that's not really going to work. People who've just been referred to us, people who are on the waiting list, people who've just had their transplant, people who are many years after transplant, they need different types of support. Okay, so once again, might be common sense, but now we know for sure. I guess the last thing that was perhaps surprising is that, we thought that people needed things like more information with their medications, more hands-on sort of practical sort of support. And in fact, that's not what they told us. What people told us was they wanted information about slightly different things like prognosis in the future and how things are going to go. And also they wanted more support with things like, how do I help my family cope? How do I help, and as carers, how do I help myself cope? Particularly during that transition straight after transplant, because you've, bust your guts trying to help someone to get their new pair of lungs, and then afterwards everything is different. And all of a sudden, how do families and patients and friends adjust to that? And I think that's another surprising thing that came out of the research.
So, based on all this work that you've done, and you came up with this proposal for Alfred Lung Transplant Survivorship Centre. I don't know if any of you know about the survivorship centre that they have at Peter MacCallum for cancer survivors, and she went along and actually investigated what was going over there, and one of the recommendations we had from the hospital is how we're going to support patients longer term. And she's done a fantastic job of developing a sort of a model based on his research, but we've struggled a little bit with working out how we're going to get this introduced into our sort of system with our patients. So, from your perspective, how do you think Lungitude and this sort of support might help us, our service, develop this along and help support the patients and the carers and look longer term, not just getting through the transplant and finding out all these things, but actually, helping patients live longer and live better?
I think, so Greg and I talked about this for some time, and I think, because we're doing such a really good job transplanting, hundreds of patients, and they're living longer, it means that we have more and more survivors that the Alfred needs to look after. And I think what we've been doing so far is fantastic, but how you look after 500 survivors isn't necessarily going to work if you have 1,000 survivors or 1,500 survivors and so on. So it's a good problem to have, but it is a problem, particularly if the hospital's not giving us more money to do the same work, right? And so I think in terms of, and to sort of echo what Glenn and Gordon and others have said today, I think what we really need to do is do a pilot project to try and figure out, what are the different ways we can look after these survivors apart from what we're already doing. And I think the two ways I think Lungitude can help us is we want to run this project, we want a project officer, but I think rather than just a doctor or nurse, it'd be really great if we could get a project officer who is perhaps a patient or a carer who's actually had a lived experience of transplantations, who knows what it's like as a transplant recipient carer. And so I think Lungitude could help us identify someone with the appropriate expertise and experience to do that. And the other way is obviously we'd like to pay this person to do that work. And so I think if Lungitude can help us pay the salary or contribute towards the salary of this project officer to really identify and think about the different models that we could use going forward, I think that would be really helpful. So one of the transplant patients who I was working with for the research project that we were talking about with Greg and I in 2015, she rang me one day and said, oh, well, there's this opportunity where we could actually work as a pair. So it's called Collaborative Pairs Australia, and it's where a patient or consumer and a clinician would pair up and work on a project together. And they're sending us, so it was a sort of an application process, shortlisting, interview and so on. So, but we've been selected and we're going to the UK to basically work with people in the UK who've done this for a while to learn the skills and then come back and then hopefully work on projects like the survivorship program. And it's really designed to have the consumer, the patient carer, as the lead. So it's not so much me trying to work out what to do, but for the consumer part of half of the pair to really take that lead, and my job is to try and support them. But I need to learn how to do that, and so that's what that's about. And the idea is that we would come back and we would also work with other pairs who may have other projects that they want to work on, and really the focus is to have the consumer, the patient or the carer be the leader rather than the clinician. And I think it sort of turns things on its head a little bit, but I think it continues exactly what we've been trying to do, and it's really important. Yeah.